Welcome to Exploring the Mystical Side of Life with your host, Linda Lang.
Hi, this is Linda Lang from ThoughtChange.com. This week, we have Leonard Perlmutter, who is the founder of the American Meditation Institute. He is also known as Ram Lav. Welcome, Leonard.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I deeply appreciate it.
We're talking about conscience, not consciousness, but conscience. Leonard, could you give us a definition of what you mean when you talk about conscience?
First of all, there are 4 functions of the mind. Now, even from early childhood, I think most of us have thought or intuited that there seem to be different voices in our mind. And as it turns out, it's true. There are actually 4 of them. And one is the conscience. And the conscience is a very interesting and important function of the mind because it is the conscience that is the only function of the mind that can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide. And when I heard that, and when I began to experiment with it, it was a game changer for me. Because what it meant to me was, surprisingly, every single choice I have ever made in my life, and every single choice I will ever make in my life, has been, and always will be, made by the conscience. And so the other 3 functions of the mind that we'll talk about in a few moments, the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind, they are simply advisors or counselors for the conscience. We don't really realize that the conscience is our decision maker. Now, how it makes its decision, in part, is dependent on the manners, if you will, of our ego, senses, and unconscious mind. Because if the truth be known, those other 3 functions of the mind can get pretty unruly.
So, Leonard, I think this is so interesting because it brings to mind, the old cartoons where there would be kind of like a devil sitting on one shoulder and an angel on the other. And a lot of people would correlate the conscience with the angel sitting on the shoulder, trying to influence our choices.
I think that it has nothing to do with the angel and nothing to do with the devil. I think that's a superimposition by the limitation of our brain and senses to try to figure things out. The conscience really only has one purpose, and that is to let us know what's to be done, when it's to be done, and what's not to be done, when it's not to be done, so that we can be led for our highest and greatest good.
And so that conscience always leads you on your highest path.
That's correct. That is the carrot. But we have to experiment to find out the truth for ourselves. Otherwise, it's just hearsay.
So why don't we listen more often?
We don't follow the advice because the conscience speaks in whispers, whereas the other 3 of the functions of the mind, ego, senses, and unconscious mind, they're loud, they're pushy, they're insistent, and they only have a limited perspective. They're often wrong, but they're never in doubt.
So would some people correlate the conscience with the higher self?
Well, yes, the conscience, it's just part of the mind's hardware, but it's very unique. The conscience has the capacity to act as a mirror, and it can reflect, it has the capacity, if the ego, senses, and unconscious mind are well behaved and quiet, then the conscience has the capacity, like a mirror, to reflect superconscious wisdom from the superconscious portion of the mind. Now, I never knew there was a superconscious portion of the mind, But as it turns out, it's beyond the conscious portion. It's beyond the unconscious portion. It's the same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein saw mathematical equations. It's the same portion of the mind where Paul McCartney hears beautiful melodies. Doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to become songwriters or physicists or mathematicians. What it does mean is if we can learn to parent and train the ego, senses, and unconscious mind to support this superconscious wisdom that only the conscience can bring into our conscious mind, then we will always be allowed to fulfill the purpose of our life without pain.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so the big question is, how do we do that? How, first of all, do we start listening?
Here's what I do. When I have an important decision to make, I make an appointment for a meeting with the ego, with the senses, with the unconscious mind and the conscience. And we all sit around the kitchen table and we have a conversation. I am the moderator. And so I might say something like this. We just had a wonderful dinner. The question in front of us is, are we going to brush our teeth? And I'd like to hear from each of you. So, ego. Now you have to understand about the ego. The ego is hardwired to the reptilian brain. What does that mean? Well, like the reptilian brain, the ego is heavily invested in self-preservation. You know, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want the form to be gone. And because of that emphasis on self-preservation, the ego has a terrible fear of annihilation. So the ego, in the midst of every relationship, asserts itself and cuts every relationship that we have in half and says something like, oh, this portion, this is pleasant. I like it. Let's reprise it. But over here, this portion, oh, this is unpleasant. I don't like it. And I think this is bad. So I want to eliminate this. But we all know from our own personal experience, that which appears as pleasant is not always good. And that which is unpleasant isn't always bad for us. So if my mind becomes addicted to the limited perspective of the ego, I'm going to wind up in a lot of pain. And so I call on the ego. What is your opinion about brushing our teeth? So the ego says, I'm against it. I'm against it. I'm against most change. I don't like it. I don't like it. So I vote no. Okay, well, thank you very much, I say as the parent. And then I call on the senses. And what is your opinion? And the senses might say something like, I'm also against it because I love the dinner and I really love the dessert. You know, if you remember, we had apple pie and that's my favorite. So I vote for a second slice of apple pie. Okay, well, thank you, senses. And unconscious mind, what is your perspective? And the unconscious mind might say, oh, I'm with the other two. That's my habit, you know. So now, as the parent, as the moderator, I encourage the ego, senses, and unconscious mind to be quiet, and I'm going to call on the conscience. And in that quietude in the mind, the conscience will have the capacity to reflect superconscious wisdom. And I want to hear from the conscience what that wisdom is. And then the conscience speaks. And the conscience might say something, well, we need healthy, strong teeth. We need healthy, strong gums. We need a healthy, strong immune system. And if we can just take a 2-minute time out and brush our teeth, that will go a long way. So I then say, all right, so let's go into the bathroom and then come back to the kitchen table and then we can share what we experienced. So we all march into the bathroom, we brush the teeth, we come back, and as the parent, I say, okay, ego, what did you experience? And senses, how about yourself? And unconscious mind, what did you think? So through that experiment, that relatively easy experiment, what has happened? I, the parent of my mind, of the ego, senses, unconscious mind, and the conscience, I have allowed each of them to speak and to be received, and I have provided each of them a pleasant experience. That some aspect of change is not going to be equated with elimination.
As you work cooperatively with each of these four parts, I would suspect that you would start having less resistance from the unconscious and the ego, especially. I think the senses are really just here to experience, right?
They are here to experience, but the senses and the mind is addicted to sense gratification. The senses, they expend a tremendous amount of our creative energy through the eyes and the nostrils and the mouth and the ears and the hands and the feet in a desperate attempt to find some object, some relationship that they think are going to bring us happiness and bring us security and bring us health. The problem is the senses are a little bit nearsighted. They can only see the front of the pleasure. They don't see the back of the pain that is often associated. So they take our creative energy and they run after all these imagined pots of gold. We're not addicted, but the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind definitely are addicted to limited perspectives. So we have all sorts of faulty concepts that we've had, gosh, long time.
I really like that you do not personalize the behavior patterns.
Right.
That you teach that it is actually, just an aspect or a part of you that has that pattern, but
Right.
there's a core sense of you
That is beyond it, but is motivated by love. I love the ego. Linda, we both need a healthy ego right now to have this conversation. And after this conversation, if I have an appointment and I have to take my automobile someplace and drive, I need a healthy ego to get me there and back home safely. So even though the ego, senses, and unconscious mind are often wrong and never in doubt, sometimes it's appropriate. Sometimes the ego is correct. A lot of times the unconscious is correct. There's a lot of good things stored in the unconscious mind. But how do we know? How do we know?
It puts a smile on my face, actually, because I know a lot of people in the spiritual circle who really kind of badmouth the ego when they're trying to get rid of the ego because they think the ego is causing all of its pain. And I think that just makes the ego more afraid and stronger.
That's right. That's my experience. Definitely. Love is the most powerful of all forces. Love is the most ancient traveler. It travels from eternity to eternity. And it is the basis of all of our emotions. It's the basis of all of our emotions. But if I am deluded by faulty concepts in my mind, and I think that I am the body, and I think that I am the ego or the senses or the unconscious mind, that's a cause of a lot of pain, a tremendous amount of a lot of pain. And that love force gets changed first and foremost into a desire for an object or a relationship that I think, again, thinking, which is overrated as far as I'm concerned, that I think is going to make me happy or secure or healthy.
Do you think it's imperative that we change our way of thinking, or are we better off spending time every day in that quiet space where we don't think?
in the space between two thoughts lies an infinite number of possibilities. And so, in that silence between two thoughts is the key. That's why if we can quiet the mind to allow the conscience to reflect superconscious wisdom into our conscious mind, then we can think about that, we can speak in service to it, and we can act in service to it, and knowing that we're always going to be led for our highest and greatest good.
And I don't think it has to be a long time, right? Like it can be fairly quickly between thoughts, that pause you're talking about.
That's right. That's right. And
Maybe-
that is something that we learn in meditation, because in meditation, first and foremost, we learn the skill of one pointed attention, of directing our mental energy toward one object. Could be a mantra, could be the breath, but that one pointed attention is the point of genius and creativity, because what it does is it automatically creates a space between stimulus and response. And what's inside that space? That's my freedom to redirect my attention to my conscience, to find out what's the thought to think, the word to speak, and the action to take. And so in meditation, we cultivate the skill of one-pointed attention, detachment, and because I checked with my conscience, I also become more discriminating and wiser. I also increase the muscles of my willpower to do what's to be done when it's to be done, and not do what's not to be done when it's not to be done.
Learning to listen, really, isn't it?
Yes.
So I would assume that as you become more proficient in pausing and hearing or listening in that pause, that maybe you don't quite as often need to set each of your four parts around the kitchen table and ask questions.
And that's a wonderful gift of human beings. We're habit makers. We create global skills for ourselves. So at a certain point, you're right, Linda, there's a global skill, and it just becomes a new way of being.
Well, I think it would be a wonderful way for people to really kind of tap into that super consciousness.
Yes.
What a different world we would have if we lived from that place.
That's where the poetry and the song begins. And we can do it. And if there's a message from COVID and this political gridlock, it's a dire necessity to allow the conscience to be our guide.
I'm curious about that little voice or that little soul nudge that kind of dangles carrots before us and guides us on our path. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of messages or how they come through? Like, how do we know that that is our conscience speaking?
Well, the ego is a wonderfully masterful ventriloquist. So a lot of times the ego pretends to be the conscience because it's so certain of itself and it's so fearful of being annihilated. So the only way to be sure is to experiment with seemingly insignificant no-brainers. It's 10 o'clock at night. You're watching a little TV to relax, and a coffee commercial comes on, and right away the ego senses and unconscious mind are ready to dash into the kitchen, have some coffee, a little half and half, a couple of spoonfuls of sugar, and maybe a second or third slice of apple pie. But the conscience, reflecting superconscious wisdom, would say, look, it's 10 o'clock at night. Caffeine keeps us up. So let's sacrifice this desire right now. That's what we have to do. Start off with small, easy, non-threatening ways to have the ego, senses, and unconscious mind experience something pleasant. Then they'll trust us.
And is there a way to make friends with all of these four parts of us?
We are a holistic organism. all of this is us. And then also beyond this. But insofar as the human being is concerned, I don't want to get rid of the ego or ostracize the ego or put the senses down, give it an inferiority complex or constantly criticize the unconscious mind. I want to emphasize the positive and teach them a new horizon rather than just living with a narrow vision.
I think it's probably important to point out that sometimes when we have these little inspirations or conversations from our unconscious, our ego, or even the superconsciousness, that they can be like instant. It's not necessarily a long drawn out conversation, right? It's almost like a flash that tries to push you towards something or away from something.
And my experience is sometimes we experience that superconscious wisdom viscerally through the gut. So this conscience isn't necessarily in our head, you see. And so a lot of times we feel it physiologically in our gut before we can intellectually understand what it is. And it's basically letting your conscience be your guide.
Yeah, I like that. As I said when we started, a lot of people think of their conscience as maybe their morality code.
It's beyond morality.
Yeah.
Take a look at what Shakespeare says. There's nothing either good or bad, only thinking makes it so.
So true. So true. Leonard, it's been a really interesting conversation. Is there any last thing you'd like to share with our listeners?
I would ask of them that they not believe a word that I have just said during this conversation. But if you're interested in any aspect of working with your conscience and the ego, senses, and unconscious mind, I will support you 100% in your own personal experimentation. Because it's only through personal experiment that you will come to know the truth for yourself. Otherwise, you're just dependent on the next talking head or the next book. And how do you know that it's true? Unless you bring it in. So I want you to be a doubting Thomas. Don't believe what I've said, but experiment with it if it sounds interesting to you.
Know thyself, right?
Exactly.
Perfect, perfect. And how could people find out more?
The book, aptly titled Your Conscience, it has its own website, yourconscience.org, and that will tell you a little bit about the book, a little bit about myself. Another website that we have is the American Meditation Institute, which I founded in 1996. And that's where we have different classes. In fact, we have a free guided meditation every Sunday morning, 9:30 to 11 Eastern Time, and there's a free link with a free recording right on our homepage. And that website is americanmeditation.org.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you, Leonard.
My pleasure. It was a delight.
And thank you for listening to this week's edition of Exploring the Mystical Side of Life. You will find all of our conversations on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Make sure you subscribe, share it with a friend. Come and visit me at thoughtchange.com and learn what energy medicine can do for you. While you're there, check out my program, Alchemy from the Inside Out. We will see you again next time. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe.